Hello everyone and welcome to this week's tutorial. So I've created a test database for this week's tutorial that contains 4 tables all related with one-to-many relationships. Those tables are country, region, local region and site. So I used Entity Framework to generate object model of the database, so that creates an EDMX file that looks very similar to the diagram in SQL, and that looks like this. So for this week's tutorial I've created some queries that I want to discuss and run. So the first one looks like that. And when we run it, we'll see the countries. There's 4 countries that were returned as by test data I've inserted earlier into the database. Those countries go like South Africa, Germany, and so forth. So if we go into South Africa first, South Africa then has 3 regions: the Northwest, Limpopo, so forth. And Limpopo has 2 local regions. One is Polokwane and the other one is Mbembe. So if you want to validate whether this data is correct, you can go and have a look in the database, but it should be correct as it's a very simple query. This shows the power of Entity Framework. You can extend this query by going db.countries and then .where countries is equals to South Africa .first.default, and then accessing the region of South Africa by going .regions and so forth. But the trouble of this query is that we've effectively loaded the entire database into memory. So if you can imagine, let's say we did load all of the countries in the world into the database, and all of the regions under those countries, and all of the local regions under those countries, and all of the sites under those local regions, then we would have put a couple of gigabytes into memory. And this will cause the server to be very slow and may lead to out-of-memory exceptions. So that is not necessarily what we'd like to do. So the alternative is to put lazy loading off, which I'll demonstrate in the next query. That looks like this. So you use this setting to switch off lazy loading, which means that all of that data is not loaded into memory. So what this query then does is, if you go db.countries.toList like in that query, it will only load the countries into memory and not everything else. So if you want to include subtables or sub-entities, you can do that with the .include function, and you can simply do that with like that. So this query will then include the regions under the countries. We can then look at the data. So we have 4 countries as before. Then the first country, South Africa, with 3 regions. Limpopo, however, doesn't have any local regions under that because we didn't include local regions. So this uses far less memory because you didn't load local regions and sites into the database, so or into memory. The idea you should get from this is that you only load data into memory that you need to use. Okay, Let me demonstrate the next query, which is a little bit more complex. So this query filters the countries where the description is equals to South Africa. So if the description matches, it will return the country object and include the regions under that, but if it doesn't match, it won't return the country. So if we look in our return, we only have one object that is returned, and that is the country South Africa with the regions under it. The other three countries don't match the description, so they were not returned. The next query I want to demonstrate an error that might occur. So I have on purpose created a spelling mistake by omitting the R from the word South Africa, and thus nothing was returned to that list. So this is an empty list with no countries in it. If I then do a further query to get regions, I could, for example, go countries.first.default.regions.first.default. The problem with this is, however, that countries doesn't have a first, as it is an empty list, and so it returns null, and you're saying null.regions.first.default. This produces a null reference exception, and so you shouldn't create queries like this. If you want to do this sort of thing, you should test for nulls before accessing data. So for the next query, I created a sample country ID, that's just sample data, then sample region ID. So the query I want to run is to get the first country with that sample country ID, and then under that country I want to get the first region with the sample region ID. The way I would do that is to go db.countries and then where the ID is equal to the sample country ID and include regions, of course, then I get the first object. I can then use country and regions and then add a where statement to get all of the regions that have the ID that match sample region ID and get the first or default for that. So here again we can see that there will be a problem if our ID is wrong, then no country will be returned, and as we use first or default, that will be null. In the next query, we use country, which is possibly null, and say .regions. If that sample country ID doesn't match any countries, then that will be null.regions, which will generate an exception. So a better way to approach this is to put an if statement before you do that query, and you can generate an exception for the user in the else. So in this way you make sure that you never use a country that is null. You'll obviously have to do the same if you drill down further to local regions for the region, then you'll have to test whether region is null. So there is another way to do all of this, and this I'll demonstrate in the next query. So in this query I created an additional function that returns an iQueryable. So the benefit of this is that you firstly break down your code into functions, which can be used to make it a little bit more dry. Dry stands for don't repeat yourself. So instead of defining this query again, another function can just use the same function to do the same thing. So instead of putting it in there, I put it in a different function, and then it can be used all over the place. So another benefit of returning iQueryable is that this doesn't return data from the database, it simply builds up the query. So this doesn't load any data into the database, and it will run relatively quickly as it only builds the SQL statement. The data is only retrieved the first time I go .first or default there. I then go and gather the regions, and I put a where in there that checks for the sample region ID, and first or default that as well. So this makes two calls to the database, one there and one there. We can obviously see again here that a problem will come if nothing is returned from this function, or if the country ID is null, because then you're going null.regions again. So you'll need to test for that. I'll demonstrate the best approach for this in the next query. Flex function that is going to look easy in this query. So traditionally you would get all of the let's say you wanted a list of all of the sites in South Africa. You'd get all of the countries in or you get the country that matches the ID of South Africa, and then go South Africa .regions, and then write a for each loop for all of those regions, and inside that write a for each loop for all of the local regions, and inside that write a for each loop for all of the sites to populate a list of sites. So I've used the principle of iQueryable to, rather than doing that where I have to access data at least 4 times, I do it once by building a query. So I wrote a function get regions with country ID because of the dry principle, and that simply returns all of the regions that match the sample country ID, as you can see there. Then there is a link function that I use called select many that selects all of the local regions under that the region that are returned from calling that first function, and then a second one that returns all of the sites under those local regions. So there are multiple benefits of doing it this way. First, we don't access the database until we call the toList function there, and that is only once. We don't need to write loops to get all of this data. We simply write a link query that makes the code a lot cleaner and easier to understand. Furthermore, the risk of null values is not present, because if you call select many, then it will return an empty list if no values are found. So let's say no local regions fall under that region, then you would not have anything populated in that array, meaning the sites array would also be empty, and that will be simply nothing. If we run it, we'll see that the result gives us all of the sites in South Africa, and you can go and check in the database if that's the case, and it will be. So let's see what happens if that is the case. So that simply returns a 0 result, as select many is not affected by a null result. It just selects nothing. In this way, we've avoided the consequences of a null result, and we've used all of the other benefits I've mentioned before. So I would also like you to use this method when you do your homework assignment to do a search query. Thank you very much for listening. This has become a little bit complicated, so you can come and see me if there's something you don't understand, or if you need further clarification of something. There are a whole bunch of other functions that you can use with link that will give you similar benefits like select many does. Please study these benefits, because that will make you a very good programmer in C#. Thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed this video.